Hi everyone, I think we'll just make a start. Welcome along to the second of three webinars based on preparing for the future. This one's based on carbon audits, and tonight we have Seamus Murphy, who is a carbon and sustainability consultant who's worked with the SEC for 6 years now. He's going to give you a run through of the background on emissions, why we should be taking action, the purpose of a carbon audit, and the uses that you can get from it, and the different approaches to completing a carbon audit. At the end of the session, I'll have a quick wrap up of the funding that's available for a carbon audit. And if you have any questions, please feel free to just chime in, or you can type them in the Q&A box down the bottom of your screen. I'll pass you over to Seamus.
Hi everyone, I hope you can all see my screen and hear me okay. I'm happy for questions to come in throughout. I'll try and answer as best I can, and I might, if a lot of questions are coming in, I'll keep an eye on it, and if a lot of questions are coming in, I can pause and take them. Otherwise, we can just leave it until the end, and we'll hopefully have plenty of time for Q&A then. So as we said, I've been working with SAC Consulting for about 6 years now, predominantly around carbon. We have, over the last 3 years, it's obviously increased the demand for carbon-related work. Carbon management work has increased significantly, and a lot of interest from different kind of companies and different people in the supply chain interested in agriculture and the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and particularly how we can reduce those. And at the heart of all of that, obviously, is completing a carbon audit, which is the first step on that journey to reducing emissions across the farm. So first off, I wanted to, if we can move on. So what do we actually mean when we say carbon audit? We're not talking about carbon, really, carbon dioxide. In a lot of industries, it is solely carbon dioxide is kind of the main source of emissions. In agriculture, that's quite different, as many of us will know. Methane is a huge contributor alongside nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide less so. I'll get into a bit of detail about those three kind of main emissions in the next slide. But essentially, your livestock farms, when predominantly beef and sheep, where you've got ruminants, they're going to be, usually, methane is going to be kind of the biggest emissions source. On an arable farm, that'll likely be more nitrous oxide, although that can vary with carbon dioxide as well, because there's a lot of machinery and stuff. Because your carbon dioxide is essentially just the kind of the end of pipe emissions. So your tractor emissions, or if you've got kind of some boiler or something like that that is producing emissions on site, that's going to be your carbon dioxide. So yeah, just to kind of reiterate that whenever it is separate as well, a carbon audit. When people talk about carbon, sometimes they get the carbon audit and carbon markets and these things mixed together. They are quite distinct. The carbon audit is something that is very much separate to most kind of carbon markets and carbon schemes like that. So it's important to just highlight the differences there, or clarify that we're kind of trying to measure the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced on farm. So those, as I mentioned, those main greenhouse gases and where they come from on farms, I'll start with methane, and enteric fermentation is usually the biggest on a livestock farm source of emissions. So from enteric fermentation, that's essentially the ruminant livestock, so the cow or the sheep, they're in the process of digesting grass, they produce methane. So it's a natural occurring process that occurs within the animal. The other kind of main source is manure and slurry management. So just when you're kind of slurry pits, when you're spreading slurry, storing manure, they tend to produce methane as well. And they're kind of the two main sources of methane, and they'll be obviously predominantly associated with livestock, and mainly or only really beef and sheep. So beef and cattle, so dairy as well. But pigs and poultry don't have that. They don't have the same problem with methane. There is a problem with managing the manure, but it's not as kind of important as you'd say with beef and sheep. Nitrous oxide then is essentially any time you're adding any nitrogen to the soil, depending on the soil conditions and the soil kind of microbial population that is there, the breakdown of that nitrogen. So if you're adding artificial fertilizer or your manures and slurry, the nitrogen that is within that will be broken down by bacteria in the soil and release nitrous oxide. The bacteria that will produce nitrous oxide, they like conditions that are that don't have oxygen. So if you've got a waterlogged field, if you've got a heavily compacted field, that's the field that is more prone to producing more nitrous oxide than, we'd say, a field that is well drained and and is kind of doing well, and with the soil, it has good soil health, we'd say. And then, as I said, carbon dioxide, usually quite a low, still not insignificant, but usually quite a low source of emissions. The gases that come from carbon dioxide are the sources of carbon dioxide. So it's essentially your emissions associated with machinery and things like that. Each of these gases have what is called a global warming potential. So I'm going to briefly touch on this, and this is a kind of a bit of a controversial one, particularly when it comes to methane. And some of you might have heard about some of this kind of the discussions around this. So the global warming potential is the effect that gas will have on warming in the atmosphere. And usually the one that is used, so the one that'll be used in all, if not all, as far as I'm aware, all of the kind of carbon calculators that you guys would be using, is GWP 100, which is the 100, essentially the warming effect of that gas over 100 years. So methane is shorter lived. It doesn't persist in the atmosphere for 100 years. Generally, I think around 10 to 12 years, and it breaks down. Now, there's debate about whether or not GWP 100 or this whole GWP approach is effective at kind of really getting down to the kind of the detail or the truly reflect, we'll say, the impact that methane has, because it is such a short-lived gas. So another way of looking at it is that there's a GWP 20, which is the impact of that gas over 20 years, and that's 81. So it's actually higher because the actual impact of methane occurs over a very short period of time. GWP Star is another method of, and it's perceived as being a better way of kind of representing that short lifespan that methane has. And a lot of the kind of farm carbon auditing tools that are out there are looking at GWP Star and looking at how they can integrate GWP Star into the auditing, the software. The one caveat I would put to that, or a word of warning, is from my research into GWP Star, it possibly does have a better kind of approach to methane, or it looks better. It doesn't, the impact isn't as great as what GWP 100 will say. However, there's still that element of, if you reduce methane quickly, or if you reduce methane, you can have really quick impact on warming. So you can really quickly reduce warming. So to me, that still kind of leaves that lingering issue there around how all these things are presented, particularly at a national level and at an international level, where some people will be saying, well, we need to reduce warming as quickly as possible. They look at methane and they say, well, let's reduce methane. And then, you know, yourself, perhaps some people will think that reducing livestock numbers is an easy way to reduce methane. So I'm always kind of a bit worried about saying, yes, GWP Star is the thing to do, because it still has that if you're reducing your methane, you're still seeing a drastic drop in the emissions. I think actually with GWP Star, the drop in emissions, if you are reducing, the drop in warming impact, if you're reducing methane emissions, is really a lot more than what we see with GWP 100. So that's just something that I think is something that is not considered when we kind of think about methane and how it can be best represented. Nitrous oxide then is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. It lasts for a long time in the atmosphere. It persists for hundreds of years. So the impact of nitrous oxide then is obviously kind of greater than methane. The base kind of with all of this GWP or the GWP is carbon dioxide. The way you kind of think about these things is, if I emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide, the warming impact of that, or if I emit 27 tons of carbon dioxide, the warming impact of that is the same as emitting 1 ton of methane. So it's almost as though methane, it's a bit more complicated than that, but almost as though methane is 27 times more potent a greenhouse gas, we'll say, than carbon dioxide. Nitrous oxide then is 273 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So that's the global warming potential. That is essentially the stuff that underpins all of these carbon calculators. There's obviously a variation within them, and the GWPs are constantly being updated, and there's, as I said, like different methodologies and different approaches being looked at. So it is kind of changeable, but essentially these gases and those numbers are generally going to be the same across all of the different carbon footprinting tools. So then I suppose the next thing is, okay, that's all good. Why actually should we care about this? Why should we spend money or look at initially carrying out a carbon audit, and then actually taking action and changing some management or changing what we're doing to reduce emissions? In the past, when I've done these kind of presentations, I've taken kind of an international view. To be honest, I think I've taken that international view because it's been easier to find examples of the impacts of climate change internationally in the past. I think over the last year or so, I think it's been a lot more obvious at home. And most of us will know will have seen, I'm sure, that video, that the picture in the top left. And that's the flooding this year and just outside Inverary, and you know, that's a massive impact on that farm. And as far as I'm aware, everything was done appropriately there in storing those bales. They were in an area that was never flooded before, but it was just the intensity of the rainfall and the flood in that scenario led to them being washed away, and that's obviously a massive hit to that farm. And you know, these kind of events, we're seeing them a bit more often. I think everyone would accept that. Similarly, if the image on the right of that, the days of brown frost, and this is just a 2022, but since 1991 and 2020, if the average days of brown frost in January in those years was significantly less, basically across all of Scotland. East Coast was a bit better than the West, but it's kind of like we're expecting to see less kind of frosty days, so less days where you might be able to get on and do some stuff on the farm over the winter, particularly in the West Coast, as it's expected to get warmer and wetter. So it just restricts your ability to actually kind of manage, or you need to kind of change your management, because you're not going to be able to get on in the winter and do some work without causing damage to the soil, which we've seen above has knock-on effects on the emissions. Similarly, down the bottom left, and that was a picture from this year. I'm from Wexford in the southeast of Ireland, and I was home not so long ago and speaking to it's good potato country down there, and speaking to a few of my friends who are farmers, and they've said they had it was too dry in earlier in the season and they didn't have enough growth, so it pushed back the harvest, and they can't get on now because it's been too wet. And I know it's kind of similar kind of situation in parts of Scotland and the wider UK as well, and there's difficulty in getting the spuds out the ground. And then that final picture there on the bottom right is just the heat wave that we had last summer, summer 2022. And just those kind of temperatures, you can imagine the impact on livestock and being out in them, and just the work that needs to go into trying to ensure that that everything is okay, and that everything is watered, there's enough shade and shelter and stuff. It's a lot. It's a lot. A lot of work involved there, and not to mention the kind of impacts on people as well. But they're just a few examples that I decided to throw in as to why we kind of should care. But obviously agriculture is a contributor to climate change. And alongside that, we're directly exposed to the impacts as these kind of these examples have shown. On a global scale, unabated climate change is expected to have far more catastrophic implications than we expect even in the UK. So, like a lot of war and famine and just if we don't act, it looks pretty dire for certain parts of the world. We look like things will change, and it'll be difficult. It'll be a difficult transition. Although I think just as a nation, I think it's our obligation to try and do something. Everyone, not just in agriculture, every single one of us do something to try and reduce the impacts of climate change. Additionally, I think as we've seen now, adapting it's not just reducing emissions. We have to adapt now. The climate has, I think, already changed, and it's just going to accelerate. If we can't reduce emissions enough to go kind of below the 2 degrees that was set out in the Paris Agreement, then the world is going to be irreversibly changed, and the way we do things will change, and we will need to adapt to that and adapt to our new climate. In terms of carbon audits, then they can help us to effectively kind of take action to reduce emissions, but also they are something that pinpoints, looking beyond kind of emissions and looking to your own business. A carbon audit can help to point out kind of hotspots for inefficiencies and things like that. Usually there is, some people say carbon and cash are kind of on the same, are like on the same kind of line. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that there are some things that are carbon is separate. They're separate, but generally a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about is inefficiencies where money is being not necessarily lost, but maybe spent unwisely, and where carbon is being emitted as a result of that. So it's those kind of things. So we'll get into that a little bit later. That was why we should care. Now I'm going to just talk a bit about why we must care, and what by this I mean we can't really avoid taking action as an industry, but also as individual businesses, as policy kind of puts pressure on us. We know that in 2025 things are going to shift with the way the basic payment is, and that looks like it's going to be based on or a lot more of it will be based on environmental action and things around that. In England, we already have the kind of ELMS, the environmental land management, is already kind of set out, and that is the basic payment has been decreased, and I think the top up is expected to be through kind of ELMS schemes. So policy is kind of pushing that way. We've got ambitious targets in Scotland to achieve net zero by 2045. That's another kind of reason why I think we're feeling the push. I think personally, and it may be because this is the kind of area that I work in, but the supply chain side of things is going to be a big driver. We're seeing it. A lot of companies are looking down their supply chain and looking at their emissions, and they're looking at agriculture and saying, okay, we've set targets, because a lot of these companies have set far more ambitious targets than the Scottish government. And they need to understand how they're going to reduce their emissions across that supply chain. And they're beginning to try and engage with farmers to carry out carbon audits, and then off the back of that take action. And we've been seeing that quite a bit more. It's really ramping up in our kind of work. Then a big one as well that is I'm not fully kind of, I don't have my finger on the pulse of this one, we'd say, but financial institutions, banks are starting to ask a lot about carbon audits, and there's a lot of banks and financial institutions that are starting to look at where they're investing and look at how they invest in low carbon or lower carbon businesses and industries. There is a net zero banking alliance, and I know that most of the major UK banking sector is signed up to that. And in that, they've set targets to reduce emissions associated with every £1 million of investment into agriculture. And I think I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but it's a significant reduction in the emissions by 2050, I think. So to do that, if that's actually going to be achieved, these banks are going to be looking for carbon audits. They're going to be looking at the carbon credentials, we'll say, of a business before they will provide finance. So whether that's kind of different loans or different, there's already kind of loans out there for with favorable rates for kind of green or green, or as they perceive it, action and things like that. Yeah, I wanted to share just some of these company targets that I kind of alluded to in the previous slide. So the Co-op, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Tesco, M&S, Waitrose, Lidl, and Aldi have all set targets, and I'm talking about what I've said scope 3 targets, because when they look at their whole business and they look at the supply chain, basically everything down the supply chain that they buy in is scope 3. So it's different to their other emissions. So they're kind of the emissions that the day-to-day emissions of running their businesses is different to the scope 3, but they've all set targets for scope 3. And as you can see, there's Waitrose is 2050, but for net zero. But other than that, the scope 3 targets are all more ambitious than Scottish Government's 2045 target. So I think that these guys are really going to start looking down the supply chain and start looking to engage with farmers. An interesting one is just Aldi, the supplier SBTi commitments by 2024. So what that is that's essentially what they're saying is that all of their suppliers need to set similar targets by 2024. So if you're an ABP, if you're an Angus soft fruits, one of these different companies that purchase directly from the or buy from farmers and then sell on to the retailer, they're going to be kind of putting that pressure back down the supply chain onto those companies that deal directly with the farmers. So it may not be Tesco come knocking on your door, but it'll be someone that is the person purchasing your products that will likely come knocking and say wanting to discuss carbon essentially. So that's the different company targets. And
just quickly, we've had a question from the audience.
Oh yeah.
To what extent does agriculture contribute to climate change?
Well, that's actually what this slide is. That's a timely question because this slide kind of answers that a bit. This is the World Resource Institute, the figure on the left-hand side, and this is global emissions. So as you can see, agriculture, forestry, and land use. But by the way, just a caveat to this. This says 18.4%. I've seen figures of up to 30%. There's different ways of measuring these kind of things, and that is why you'll see this variation. Generally, you can agriculture is, we'll say, second or third in the industries or in the kind of the emissions. So I actually think though that like when I see this slide, you see obviously agriculture is like a big chunk there. It's a significant chunk, and it's not. We know that we have to do work to try and reduce those emissions. However, it is also plain to see that the burning of fossil fuels for energy is still by far the main driver of climate change and has been. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in, essentially. So, that's not to say that agriculture doesn't have work to do. I think we've all accepted that, and we all are. I think the industry as a whole is kind of extremely open to change and wants to kind of I suppose take advantage of some of the opportunities, but it's just to take that into account. Another point to kind of that I like to point out with this is, and you can't really see it unfortunately there with the it's been cut out, but livestock and manure in this study accounted for 5.8%. So that's kind of methane emissions from livestock agriculture really, or it'll be a variation of all of those things, but like livestock and manure 5.8%. The fugitive emissions is the 5.8% that you can kind of see. It's fugitive emissions, which are essentially the like flaring of natural gas or flaring of at refineries and things like that. So essentially, and leaky pipes and these kind of things in the fossil fuel industry. So there is that, and I want to reiterate, I don't think that this shouldn't be taken as, you say, oh, it's fine, we don't have to do anything because it's not that big a deal. Like we have a lot to do, but the fugitive emissions from fossil fuels is equivalent to livestock manure in this study, and there are different ways of accounting for these different things. But that's just something that I always kind of like to point out here, because although we have a power of work to do, there's definitely the fossil fuel industry have been the main driver of this, and they have they have to completely change. We have to completely change them. We as society need to put the pressure on that as well. So I hope that answers the question. Anyway, so the agricultural focus then for these companies, we'll say, the scope 3 element is usually around 95% of total emissions, and some of these companies have published what emissions are what are attributed to agriculture. So M&S have 72% of their total emissions is from agriculture, and Tesco about 50% of their total emissions. So that's why these companies are kind of showing an interest in agriculture, and showing an interest in how they can reduce emissions associated with agriculture, and looking for carbon audits. So what finally eventually got into what a farm carbon audit is. So essentially, as we kind of talked about it, it is trying to measure your main greenhouse gases from the different say operations that are occurring on your farm. So the different things that are causing emissions, so methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. As I said, usually these where you've got a lot of emissions, or if you've got different carbon audit software are better or worse, I'd say, at pointing out these kind of things. But the hotspots where emissions are can be usually a sign of an inefficiency, or a sign of something that you need to look at, maybe, or something that you could kind of say, oh, well, actually, maybe we have to think about how we do that, or think about that a bit more. And a massive thing for me is I really feel a carbon audit in isolation is not near as powerful a tool as a collection of carbon audits that have been carried out year on year. And I'll get onto why I think that in a minute. So I just thought I would share this slide here. And this is basically just this is AgriCalc. So I'm most familiar with AgriCalc. When AgriCalc is now kind of spun out of SSE Consulting, but when AgriCalc was a part of SSE Consulting, I worked quite closely with the team there, and I'm quite familiar with that as a platform. And this is just an example of a farm, of what you might get from your really basic report that you get off the back of AgriCalc. So it's not necessarily, if you've got a consultant to do a report for you, the consultant will come up with kind of opportunities or areas that you can work on to reduce your emissions. But for me, I just wanted to point out a couple of things here, and like, this is a comparison between all the other farms that are on AgriCalc that have the same system as this. So this is a breeder finisher, so a suckler farm, and the beef, and just little things, kind of like fertilizer use is higher than the average across the whole kind of other farms that are on AgriCalc. Purchased feed is quite high as well. If you kind of look over here then to the actual figures and the comparison figures, purchase feed is a little bit higher, but homegrown fodder use is quite a bit lower. So I suppose those two things are probably contributing to this additional or increased purchased feed. So I suppose that in itself could be something that, okay, maybe we need to look at our purchase feed, or can we improve our homegrown fodder and that kind of thing. Similarly, with the enteric fermentation, which is slightly higher, that's the kind of emissions associated with the livestock. So essentially what that is a large part of that is the how long that animal is kind of on farm. And the longer they're on farm, say past the point where they need to be, or if there's issues with health, where you're kind of losing some more. So you've got an animal that is kind of struggling, and then needs culled or something like that. That all contributes to the enteric fermentation based off of the kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of dead weight. So that's increasing. If you've got, we'll just say 10 cattle, and you need to, you're only getting, and three of them are not really thriving, they're not really doing well, and they're there longer. Your whole emissions per kilo of dead weight is going to be increased by those three cattle, you'd say. So it's kind of like getting in a good culling regime can kind of knock out those inefficiencies and make sure that you kind of got the most efficient cattle there, which saves money on feeding, kind of saves on everything, just becoming more efficient in that way, but has a massive impact on the emissions. So this is just an example, but this is kind of just to highlight. I'm not going to go into detail on every kind of different type of system, but this is just to show you that a carbon audit can be useful in highlighting areas or getting the kind of cogs going in your brain about, okay, how can I improve efficiencies in this area, or I wonder why actually my entire fermentation is a bit higher there. I wonder why fertilizer use or fertilizer emissions are higher than the average across. And sometimes I'll get into it in the next slide, I think, but or the slide after this actually. So yeah, there is a significant data requirement when you're filling out a carbon audit. If you've got good kind of bookkeeping, that helps an awful lot. And the big thing I rubbish in, rubbish out. If you're estimating, guesstimating, if you're just I think that's what it is, and you don't have the figures at hand, the usefulness of the carbon audit is just reduced. You're just not getting something that is as useful as you would like it to be. So you want to get the data as accurate as possible, and really estimates should be a last resort. Although it's better to do it with estimates than not do it at all. But then the next year, make plans and try and say, okay, I estimated last year on this. What do we need to do to be more accurate next year? Because then it'll start to become more useful for you as an actual tool. And as I said there, kind of give you the best opportunity to make changes that will help you see improvements, and then you can actually see those improvements on the audit the following year as you keep going. And that's why it's really important, I think, to get into kind of continuing to complete carbon audits, or having an audit in isolation is not as powerful as having multiple audits. Yeah, and just a note on the calculators themselves are changing. So sometimes as more data or more kind of research becomes available, these tools are updated regularly, and things change, and more things get included, and things get excluded, and all that kind of thing. So it's just to be aware of that the data requirements might change. So this is me. I modeled a farm, and it was a beef, I think it was a finisher, and I just said, right, this is what you could say, go to a buyer, or go to like a retailer or something like that if you're have one carbon audit. Obviously, it's useful for you to look at the different kind of areas that we spoke about, but in terms of kind of telling a story about your farm, or trying to say that we have because what is a good carbon audit? What is a good number here? It's really the farm by farm basis, because every farm is different, and we all know that there's different kind of soil issues, gradient, all of these kind of different things that can affect the carbon audit. So we'll say that's what you have if you just do one audit. If you do 5 years, which this model farm has, you can kind of begin to tell a story. So what this farm was they were at 37 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of beef dead weight. In 2018, they began liming. There was a big liming plan. They had an extremely poor year as well, weather-wise, I think it was, or health maybe in 2020. So they kind of gradually increased their emissions. But then they started to see the improvements of the action that they were taking in the first couple of years, and then they got their emissions down to their carbon footprint down to 30 per kilogram CO2 per kilo of beef. And then you can kind of see, you can dig into this a bit more in the overall the farm emissions. So you've got your CO2, methane, and your nitrous oxide. So predominantly methane emissions, but and you can see the kind of spike in 2020 as well. This is the thing that's important because agriculture is so at the mercy of weather and at the mercy of these different things that it's uncontrollable. Being able to kind of show something like this and say, oh, well, that year we had having a bit of a narrative, maybe it was like a poor year weather-wise. We didn't get as much silage as we wanted, so we had to buy in additional feed. We had to take them in earlier, so we had to buy more bedding. We had some healthy, like all of these kind of things. If you're just a carbon audit in isolation and you look at this and you say, oh well, I'm 55 kilos of CO2 equivalent per kilo of beef, that's not a true reflection of your business or of the emissions associated with your product. This is a true reflection, and I think this is going to be more powerful. Obviously, we're at the start. A lot of not many farms will have this. Very few farms will have this. But as we kind of continue on towards those different kind of targets that were set out by the retailers and Scottish government and all this, I think this sort of information is going to become far more powerful. That I think is essentially me. I just wanted to briefly touch on different approaches, and I see there's a couple of different or new comments there, so I'll try and wrap up so we can get some questions in. But just to highlight this, because I think when it comes to carbon audits, whenever I speak to farmers, there's always a bit of frustration, I'd say, around what can and can't be included. So if you've got woodland on your farm, but the woodland doesn't actually reduce the emissions associated with your beef or whatever, that kind of thing. There are international standards. There are things that we kind of have to adhere to. There are different approaches for whether you are auditing a company. So that is the boundary. If you're considering the farm business, it's essentially just the boundary of your farm and everything that happens on that, nothing else. So and it's your business emissions. So you can include, say, a woodland on that because that's included in your boundary. And so your whole business includes the forestry and the agricultural line. So the forestry, the sequestration due to forestry, it can be attributed to your business. Whereas if you're looking at a product, unless the forestry or the removals is what we call it, so the kind of the sequestration of carbon is directly a part of the production process. So there's a lot of talk about soil carbon and regenerative agriculture, and that touches the production process because that's it's a management practice, and that is in theory increases soil carbon. Therefore, the reduction or the removal of carbon from the atmosphere can be attributed to the production of whatever it is, whether it's barley or whether it's sheep, whatever you're kind of producing on that land. If you can kind of prove that you're sequestering carbon, then that can be attributed to the product, and then that emissions reduction can follow your product. So you can say that you have a lower carbon product, or you can go up this that can go up the supply chain, and whoever is buying your product can say, right, well, that's great. I want to buy the low carbon product. Then there's the supply chain side of things, which looks at everything from before the farm and after the farm and all the way through to end use in some cases. And that's what a lot of these kind of larger companies want to do, or that's what they have done. And then when they look at those kind of emissions associated with their whole supply chain, they see that agriculture is a large proportion of it, and that's what kind of focuses their mind on it. And then the national inventory, which is obviously the thing that estimates all of Scotland's emissions. And that is another kind of source of, I think, contention sometimes when I'm speaking to farmers. But yeah, because it separates out, although we consider kind of it's if there is woodland on a farm, we consider that a part of kind of the agricultural system. Right? It's still a farm, whereas the national inventory just completely blocks it off to this is agricultural emissions and this is the sequestration due to forestry, and there's no mixing of those two things. That is just the way that it is done at an international level. So to be comparable with other countries, that's the way we kind of have to do it. One big thing of mine that I really think is I hope to see it changing is that the national inventory, it's all based on production. So it's all based on what we emit in the boundary of Scotland or the UK, rather than what we consume. And I think what we consume is far more important, because it shows us the impact that we actually have. And similarly, and something I read recently, I think it was in the Scottish Farmer, but it was someone made a point that with the production, I don't think, and this is just all hypothetical, but by using the production approach, if we completely stop producing beef in Scotland, but we imported all of the beef that we're kind of currently producing in Scotland, imported that from Brazil or elsewhere, because we are the inventory is production focused, that would not be picked up. So we would have a massive reduction in agricultural emissions because it's all based on what we produce as opposed to what we consume. So the fact that we've basically just switched from using our Scottish beef that we have, that is absolutely more environmentally friendly in terms of land use anyway. Definitely 100% is like has a far better impact on the environment than anything that's coming from Brazil. And I would argue that is just not kind of seen in the national inventory approach that we currently have. So that's just something that's just a bugbear of mine. But it's good to be aware of these different things, because sometimes I feel that there's a frustration because of the way things are being done. And the reason why they're being done like that is because there are kind of different standards that are international or even just UK standards that everyone has to adhere to if you're doing that. Most of these kind of carbon auditing tools will adhere to. So I think that's me, and I'm after going way longer than I had hoped. So just the conclusion is basically just going over all of what we already spoke about. So
So one of the questions is, does the carbon audit take into account the CO2 taken up by grass, neeps and cereals to feed to the cattle?
the CO, does that mean the CO2? Well, like if you mean kind of the CO2 that is like removed from the atmosphere by the grass and the other kind of feed, that depends on AgriCalc is able to do that. Some of the calculators are able to do that. It is based on models that are quite. I wouldn't have full confidence in the number that it spits out, but I would have confidence in if it is kind of saying that it's is reducing emissions, or there has been say carbon removed from the grass. If it is saying that, I don't have confidence in the number, but I have confidence that it is picking up on the removal. So yeah, it does. The AgriCalc does with the soil carbon module. Although I would just tread carefully with the number, but I would, you can kind of rest assured that it's it is removing carbon, or that there is kind of a positive benefit from the grass. The one thing there is that the only way to actually properly measure that is through actually kind of regularly measuring for soil carbon at different depths and things like that. So it's quite a difficult thing to do. Although I know some of the carbon tools have that planned, that essentially if you were to go out and take soil samples for soil organic carbon, you would be able to build that into the calculator, which would then be able to give you a far more accurate representation of the carbon that has been removed from the atmosphere from growing the grass. So are these different kind of feeds? Although I think if it was kind of, yeah, turnips and these kind of things that are root crops are probably a bit more harder to yeah, it's just harder to account that, I would say.
Okay. Does anyone have any final questions for Seamus before we wrap up?
I see Neil has commented back there saying that it's a woolly answer. I appreciate that, but soil carbon is incredibly complex. It's really difficult to effectively measure it. Most of these things are modeled, and when they're modeled, the reason, you know, I just don't trust these models. If something isn't actually going out and measuring something, then my confidence in it is really low. So, and I appreciate that, like, there is an awful lot of research going into soil carbon and how we can kind of yeah, I suppose firm up the science behind it. And there are advances in how we can measure soil carbon. So yeah.
Quickly touch on funding before we wrap up. So there is a grant available through the PSF fund on rural payments. You get up to £500 towards your carbon audit, and it runs on the calendar year. So if you've completed your carbon audit in 2023, you need to have your claim submitted by February in 2024. And if you complete your carbon audit in 2024, your claim has to be in by the February of 2025. And again, you can contact your local office for more advice and to get a date in the diary to get your carbon audit completed. Just before we finish, if you wouldn't mind, a poll's about to get launched. If you could quickly answer the 3 questions just before you go, that would be very much appreciated. And thank you for coming along tonight. And thank you to Seamus for hosting and giving us such a great presentation.
Thanks. And if anyone wants to contact me or discuss anything that I mentioned tonight, feel free to drop me an email, or you can find me on SAC Consulting on the website, or Seamus Murphy, Seamus.Murphy at sac.co.uk if you'd like to have a chat.
Okay, thanks everyone. You're free to go after you've filled out your poll. Thank you for attending.